Hello, and welcome to Wholesome Monday, where we are diving into our very first chapter book, Nancy's Mysterious Letter. If you missed last week, I highly recommend you go check out chapter 1, where we start off the story and discuss a little bit about the mechanics of the characters and the stories that are introduced to us in chapter 1, and then come back here. If you already watched chapter 1, welcome back. I hope you are excited to dive into chapter 2. I know I am. And I have a feeling it is going to be difficult to wait a whole week to read every chapter. What did we do? It's like episodic TV. What did we do before we could marathon everything? Do you know what I mean? If you're watching this far down the line in the future after we've already finished this series, lucky you. You can just marathon every episode. All right, I'm not going to talk too much about it because it was already covered in chapter 1, but in case you're new here, I will be posting the chapter readings on Spotify in case you only want to listen to the story itself, and then you can pop back here for the discussion. I will put a timestamp right down here somewhere along this bottom line, wherever you can jump to start off the discussion. All right, without further ado, let's just hop right into chapter 2. Did not mean for that to rhyme. Chapter 2, Vanished Money. Ooh. When the mail carrier did not respond to first aid treatment by Hannah Gruen and the girls, the housekeeper insisted they call a doctor. You know, what was it like back in the day when you could literally call the doctor to come to your house? Imagine not having to wait a whole week or two to get into your doctor's office. Or if you had an emergency, like you didn't have to wait, I don't know, 12 to 24 hours in the emergency department. Like you literally just pick up your telephone and you say, hey, I need a doctor. And they just fucking show up at your door. Whatever, 10, 20 minutes later. Anyways, sorry, that was a tangent. I'll telephone Dr. Amundsen up the street even. She lives on the same block as the doctor. I promise I won't interject anymore. I'll telephone Dr. Amundsen up the street, Nancy offered. He was not the Drews physician, but she was sure that in this emergency he would come. The line was busy and continued to be so. George became nervously impatient. Oh, why bother? I can run up there just as fast. She grabbed her coat and went out the door. When Mrs. Gruen continued to administer first aid to the unconscious mail carrier, she told Nancy and Bess more about him. Ira Nixon was a bachelor and lived in a small house on the other side of River Heights. It had belonged to his mother, who had survived 2 husbands. When she died, it was learned she had willed the property and a small amount of money to Ira. Ooh. What an exciting prospect, women owning property. But now a half-brother, 30 years younger, was demanding 50% of the money. So far, Ira had refused because the inheritance had actually belonged to Ira's father, and the mother had kept it all these years for his son. Ira told me his half-brother, Edgar, has been very nasty lately, and has even threatened to go to court to upset the will. Poor Mr. Nixon, Bess said softly. The housekeeper went on to say that Edgar had become very obnoxious and had almost succeeded in intimidating Ira. She sighed. Probably Ira won't be able to hold out much longer. He is too old and weak to resist. Where does this half-brother live? Nancy asked. Ira doesn't know. Edgar never would tell him. And also he would never tell him what business he was in. Only yesterday, when Ira came here with the mail, he told me that Edgar had been to see him the night before and became furious when Ira would not give him any money. He called him all sorts of dreadful names and finally said, I'll make you suffer like this. I'll ruin you. Hannah's last statement gave Nancy an idea. Do you suppose the person who stole the mail could have been Edward Nixon? She asked. I'll bet it was, Bess replied. When you described him to Ira, the poor old man recognized who he was, and that's why he fainted. Edgar must be an absolutely despicable person." The others agreed. Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of George with the doctor. The girls went to the kitchen during the examination that followed, but Hannah Gruen remained with Ira. Nancy said she should notify the police and the postal inspector about the theft, and I'd better call Dad, too. When her friend, Police Chief McGinnis, came on the wire, she gave him the story. "We'll put out an alarm for the man in the yellow coat," he told her. Nancy next called the River Heights post office. The postal inspector was not in, but an investigative aide took the message and said he would pass the word along. Nancy's third call was to her father's office. Mr. Drew was a prominent attorney, and his daughter always felt flattered when he asked her opinion or advice on a case where a mystery was involved. In a few minutes, Mr. Drew's secretary put the attorney on the line. "Dad, we've had some real excitement at the house this morning," she said, and proceeded to tell him what had happened. "Ira Nixon hasn't regained consciousness yet. The doctor is here now." "Well, you are full of news," Mr. Drew said. "Keep me informed on what's happening. Now, about this registered letter. I'm afraid it may have contained a large sum of money." Nancy was horrified. Did the thief know this, and was it the reason he had waited for a chance to steal the mail? "Where was the letter from?" she asked. "Isn't it unusual for people to send money through the mail nowadays?" "Indeed it is, and a very bad thing to do," the lawyer replied. "I suspect that this registered letter may have come from a client of mine, Mrs. Quigley. I take care of most of her affairs, and she sends me money every so often. I've told her repeatedly to mail me only checks, but I have a hunch that she has ignored my advice again." "Did she always send her letters to the house?" Nancy asked. "Usually," Mr. Drew answered. "I'll call her at once and find out if—" "Hold the line a moment, Nancy." She waited several seconds, then her father came back on the line. "My secretary has just buzzed me to say that Mrs. Quigley is in the outer office. I'll talk to her and call you back." While waiting, Nancy told Bess and George about the client who insisted upon sending large amounts of money through the mail. It was not long before Mr. Drew had called back. "Hello, Nancy? What I feared is true. Mrs. Quigley feels very bad about the whole thing. We're sure it was her letter that was stolen." "Oh, Dad, this makes an embarrassing situation for you, doesn't it?" Nancy queried. "Yes, it does," her father replied. "Having my client's money stolen from my house." Then he added, "How's Ira Nixon?" Nancy put down the phone and hurried toward the living room, calling out, "Mrs. Gruen, my father is on the line. He wants to know how Mr. Nixon is." "He is coming around," the housekeeper answered. "The doctor says he'll have to go to the hospital, though, for a complete checkup." Nancy ran back to the kitchen and reported this to her father. He sighed in relief. "I'm glad the poor old man is regaining consciousness," he said. "Well, I must talk to Mrs. Quigley now. See you at dinner." Mrs. Gruen came to tell the girls that they might return to the living room. Mr. Amundsen explained that he must get back to his office immediately to see a number of patients who were waiting. Mrs. Gruen had kindly offered to get in touch with Mr. Nixon's regular doctor, he said. She will ask him to make arrangements for an ambulance to come from River Heights Hospital and take Mr. Nixon there. He is recovering nicely, but he shouldn't go home yet. Ira's physician promised to be at the hospital by the time his patient reached there. The ambulance would arrive at the Drew home in about 20 minutes. Nancy was eager to ask the carrier some questions, but realized he was in no condition to discuss his brother, especially one who was so mean to him, she thought. Ira Nixon himself brought up the subject of the missing letters. "I feel better now. Guess that doctor's shot put new life into me. Sorry I can't tell you where your father's registered letter came from. I didn't notice." Nancy asked gently, "Did you, by any chance, see the return address on the envelope to me?" Ira Nixon closed his eyes and his brow furrowed as he tried to remember. Finally, he said, "Seems to me your letter was not from one person. It was more like 3 names." "A business firm," Nancy suggested. Again, the mail carrier tried hard to remember. Finally, he shook his head. "It's not much hope, I guess. My head's getting too old to remember things very long, but I seem to recall the first word in the name. It was... Nancy and the others waited expectantly. They could see Ira Nixon's lip move as if he was murmuring several names before saying one aloud. Finally, a faint smile spread over his face. "I remember," he said, "clear as a bell. The first word was Malmesbury." "That's a wonderful help," Nancy told him, but she was thinking there probably were a lot of Malmesburys in London, or its vicinity. It would take her a long time to find out who the sender of her mysterious letter was. Just then, the ambulance arrived and 2 interns came into the house with a stretcher. Ira Nixon brushed the stretcher aside. "Long as I got 2 good legs, I'm going to walk," he insisted. "I'm sorry, sir," one of the interns said, "but it's a hospital rule." The letter carrier frowned. "You mean it's a law I've got to ride on that thing? What'll people think?" The others smiled. The interns helped Ira Nixon onto the stretcher and carried him to the ambulance. "We'll follow in my car," said Nancy. She hurried to her car and the 3 girls hopped in. As soon as Ira Nixon was comfortably settled in the hospital, the girls said goodbye and left. Nancy first took George, then Bess, to their homes. "What a morning," Bess remarked as she waved goodbye. "Keep us informed on what happens." "I will," Nancy promised. She had been in her own house only long enough to say to Hannah, "What's for lunch?" when once again the front door bell rang. Nancy went to answer it. A young man stood there. He introduced himself as Mr. Horace Moore, an investigative aide to the River Heights postal inspector. "Are you Nancy Drew?" he asked gruffly. "Yes, I am." The young man stared at her hard. Then he said, "Young lady, you've broken the law. You're in trouble with the authorities." Okay. And that's the end of chapter 2. I don't know why it took so long to say that. How exciting. I feel like less happened in chapter 2. I think it was a little bit shorter. I guess not a lot happened, but still a decent amount happened. We didn't get as much information, I guess, except that Ira is very headstrong and does not like help and just would do everything on his own if he could. But the end again, end of chapter 2, a cliffhanger. I wonder if every chapter will end in a cliffhanger. Maybe that's how they get you in these books. No wonder I just zoomed through them as a kid. I was just like, next, next, next. Especially a kid with undiagnosed ADHD. Anyone else out there was that like, I'm going to start a book right before bed, but then you would just be up all night reading instead of actually going to bed? That was me. That was me. Except I didn't have to hide under my covers with a flashlight. I had a desk lamp. Not a desk. Yeah, I guess a desk lamp. I had a lamp on the side table beside my bed. And that is what I used to read into the wee hours of the morning as a child. All right, chapter 2, Vanished Money. So we finally get to meet Nancy's dad. Very convenient that Mrs. Quigley just so happened to show up right when he needed to talk to her at the office. And we never actually find out why she was there for real. All right, Nancy lives on the same block as a doctor. Exciting, exciting. We find out, about Ira's backstory with his family. His mom owned property. Edgar has a surprise, or sorry, not Edgar, Mr. Nixon. Ira has a surprise half-brother, which honestly, not that surprising from back in the day. I feel like, I don't want to say it was common for men to have children out of wedlock and end up with secret families or surprise half-siblings, but I feel like it wasn't uncommon. So I guess immediately Edgar is not painted as a very nice person. He is harassing poor Mr. Nixon, the elderly mail carrier. I do find it interesting how Nancy and her friends immediately just take this first description of Edgar as truth and fact. especially Nancy, who's supposed to be a detective, she hasn't met him. She has no idea what he's like. They haven't actually proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the thief is Edgar for sure. They are making a lot of assumptions in this chapter, which I don't think is bad. I think what it really does is highlight and remind the reader that Nancy is still a teenager. She's not an adult. She is not a real detective. She is an amateur detective, right? So these are just little things that I guess continue to highlight her character, who she is, the things that she's good at as an amateur detective, and the things that she still struggles with as a young amateur detective. They help Mr. Ira get to the hospital, and then the River Heights postal inspector shows up and accuses Nancy Drew of breaking the law. I do not know which law this is. I do know that in the United States, it's illegal to open someone else's mail, but I do also know that, sorry, random fact, if you send mail to somewhere with the person's name, but the address is wrong, technically the people at that address can open it, something along those lines. The mail law is very vague, up for interpretation. I only know this because recently a voice actor came out about one of the streaming services like stealing his mail basically from fans. It was really it was really upsetting, to be honest. But through that, I learned of this mail loophole. So if you're sending fan mail to someone that's like via a corporation, the corporation can open your mail and just take it. Random facts. I don't know. The more you know. I don't know if I have too much else to talk about this chapter. I am interested to actually meet Edgar. What the? God, this strap. I am excited to meet Edgar, to find out actually what he is like for real. The very beginning description set him up to seem like a shady character, honestly, because I think he's name dropped in here, right? Yeah, the villainous Edgar Nixon. He's set up as being the villain and a nasty person from the very description of the book. Spoilers. But I do wish that Nancy hadn't just immediately made assumptions on this guy's character. I have nothing else to say. If you noticed anything, comment down below. Let me know what you think. Let's start a discussion. What did you think of chapter 2? Did you like it? Did you also notice the things that I noticed? Did you notice things that I didn't notice? Please tell me. I would love to hear your thoughts. And with that being said, I will see you guys all next week for chapter 3 and on Thursday for poetry. Bye! Thank you to everyone on my Patreon. Your support means so much to me, and I couldn't do this without you.